Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the blood-soaked, herb-scented world of medieval midwifery, where your job description literally includes keeping mothers and babies alive with nothing but prayers, plants, and sheer determination. Picture this. It's 3 a.m. on a freezing February night in 1347, and you're being dragged from your warm bed because someone's water just broke 3 villages over. You grab your leather satchel filled with mysterious powders, mumble a quick prayer to Saint Margaret, patron saint of childbirth, and trudge through ankle-deep mud knowing that by sunrise, you might be washing blood from your hands or digging a grave. You probably won't survive this career choice, statistically speaking, but someone has to catch the babies. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our little global community of insomniacs and history nerds. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up to pounding on your door, and immediately your stomach drops. Middle of the night knocks never bring good news in medieval times. Through the wooden shutters, you can see a flickering torch and hear urgent whispers. The voice belongs to Edmund, the baker's son, and he's practically vibrating with panic. "Please come quickly," he gasps, still catching his breath from his sprint across town. "My sister Agnes, her time has come, but something's wrong. The baby won't come, and she's been laboring since yesterday evening." You're already reaching for your cloak before he finishes speaking, because this is what you do. This is what you've always done, ever since your own mother taught you to catch babies when you were barely 14 years old. Back then, watching your first delivery, you thought it would be beautiful, all that talk about new life and miracles. Nobody mentioned the screaming, the blood, or the way women sometimes just don't make it through. Your hands move automatically through your preparation ritual. First, the leather birthing stool that your grandmother carved herself, worn smooth by decades of laboring women. Then your collection of herbs: pennyroyal for pain, mugwort for difficult births, and feverfew for when things get really desperate. You grab your sharpest knife not for any gruesome reason, just for cutting the cord, and your precious vial of holy water blessed by the parish priest last Easter. The medieval birthing kit you carry represents generations of accumulated wisdom, though wisdom might be a generous term for some of these remedies. Your leather pouch contains dried ergot for speeding labor, yes, the same fungus that occasionally causes mass hallucinations when it contaminates grain supplies. There's also powdered unicorn horn, which is actually narwhal tusk shavings that cost more than most families earn in a month, supposedly capable of detecting poison and purifying difficult births. You keep a small mirror for checking if newborns are breathing, since medieval people believed breath would fog reflective surfaces, and a collection of blessed medals depicting various saints who might take pity on laboring mothers. The walk to Agnes's house gives you time to run through possibilities in your head. Breech presentation? You've turned babies before, though it's always a gamble. Cord wrapped around the neck? Tricky, but manageable if you work fast. Baby stuck in the birth canal? Well, that's when you really start praying, because your options get limited quickly in an era before anyone understood anatomy beyond mysterious lady parts that somehow make babies. Edmund's chattering fills the silence as you navigate the narrow, garbage-strewn streets. Medieval waste management apparently consisted of chuck it outside and hope it biodegrades eventually, so you're constantly stepping around suspicious puddles and decomposing kitchen scraps. The smell hits you first when you reach their cottage, that distinctive metallic scent of blood mixed with fierce sweat and burning tallow candles. Inside, Agnes is propped up against a pile of straw mattresses, her face gray and slick with perspiration. Her mother hovers nearby, wringing her hands and muttering what sounds like prayers but might be curses. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. 3 neighbor women cluster in the corner, presumably there to help but mostly just adding to the general atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Medieval childbirth was apparently a community event, like a really stressful dinner party where someone might die. You assess the situation quickly. Agnes has been pushing for hours with no progress, which means either the baby is positioned wrong, too big for her narrow pelvis, or already dead and creating complications. None of these possibilities have particularly cheerful outcomes with your current medical toolkit, but you've worked miracles before with less. How long between the pains? You ask Agnes's mother, already rolling up your sleeves and trying to project confidence you don't entirely feel. This is the performance aspect of medieval midwifery that nobody talks about. Half your job involves convincing everyone in the room, including yourself, that you know exactly what you're doing. They started yesterday after morning prayers. She replies, which means Agnes has been in active labor for nearly 24 hours. That's not automatically catastrophic, but it's definitely moving into complicated delivery territory. You've seen women labor for days and still deliver healthy babies, but you've also seen women die from exhaustion when their bodies just couldn't sustain the effort anymore. Medieval understanding of labor progression was fascinatingly wrong in almost every detail. Most people believed contractions were caused by the baby actively fighting to escape the womb, like a tiny prisoner staging a jailbreak. The length of labor was supposedly determined by the child's personality. Stubborn babies took longer, while eager ones arrived quickly. Some midwives claimed they could predict delivery timing by examining the mother's palms, reading the lines like a medieval GPS system for babies. You approach Agnes and speak directly to her, keeping your voice calm and steady. Medieval women often had 6, 7, 8 children, so most of your patients knew the process. But first-time mothers like Agnes lived in terror of the unknown. I need to examine you, you tell her gently. It might be uncomfortable, but I need to understand what's happening inside. This is where medieval obstetrics gets genuinely challenging. You have no understanding of cervical dilation, no knowledge of proper fetal positioning, and definitely no sterile gloves. Your entire diagnostic toolkit consists of what you can feel with your fingers and whatever Agnes can tell you about her pain. It's like trying to fix a complex machine while blindfolded, using only your sense of touch and hoping you don't accidentally break something vital. The concept of sterility won't be discovered for another few centuries, so you wash your hands in whatever water is available, usually cold, sometimes soapy if the family can afford it. Medieval people did understand that cleanliness was generally good, but they attributed infections to bad air or moral failings rather than invisible organisms. You've noticed that births go better when you wash thoroughly, but you assume it's because clean hands please God rather than because you're preventing bacterial infections. Your fingers confirm your worst suspicion: the baby is presenting shoulder first, which means it's basically stuck sideways in the birth canal. This is called a transverse lie, though you don't know that term yet since medical terminology won't be standardized for another few centuries. What you do know is that babies don't come out sideways, and if you can't turn this child manually, both mother and baby will die. I need everyone except her mother to leave, you announce firmly. The neighbor women protest. Apparently childbirth was considered community entertainment in medieval times, but you hold your ground. What you're about to attempt requires concentration. And frankly, if things go badly, there's no reason for half the village to witness it. You've performed internal version procedures before, though the success rate is roughly equivalent to winning a medieval lottery. The technique involves reaching inside the womb, locating the baby's head or feet, and physically rotating the child into a better position for delivery. It's extremely painful for the mother, dangerous for the baby, and requires a level of anatomical intuition that you've developed purely through trial and error. Before beginning, you offer Agnes a piece of leather to bite down on and a swig from your emergency flask of strong ale. Medieval pain management was basically non-existent beyond alcohol and prayer, though some midwives had access to poppy-based tinctures for extreme situations. The wealthy might get imported wine mixed with mandrake root, but Agnes's family can barely afford bread, so she gets whatever numbing you can provide from your personal stash. Agnes screams as you begin the procedure, her fingernails digging into her mother's arms. You feel the baby's tiny shoulder, trace the curve of its spine, and slowly, carefully, begin encouraging it to rotate. Medieval anatomy texts, when they existed at all, were based on dissections of animals rather than humans, so your understanding of internal structure comes entirely from hands-on experience. You've developed an almost supernatural ability to navigate by touch alone. Agnes's contractions actually help, providing the pressure you need to guide the baby into proper position. After what feels like hours but is probably only minutes, you feel the shift. The baby's head drops into the birth canal, and suddenly Agnes's pushing becomes productive again. You catch a glimpse of dark hair and know you've won this particular battle against medieval mortality statistics. The actual delivery proceeds relatively normally after that, if you can call any aspect of medieval childbirth normal. The baby emerges blue and silent, which sends everyone into fresh panic until you clear fluid from its mouth and nose using a hollow reed you keep for exactly this purpose. This first cry fills the cottage, and you experience that rush of relief and triumph that makes all the midnight house calls worthwhile. You tie off the umbilical cord with thread spun from Agnes's own sheep. Medieval people believed using the family's materials created a stronger spiritual connection between mother and child. The placenta delivers intact, which is always a good sign, and Agnes's bleeding seems manageable. You pack the wound with clean cloth soaked in wine, one of the few genuinely effective antiseptic practices you've stumbled onto through trial and error. Historians still argue whether medieval midwives truly understood the importance of delivering the placenta completely, but experienced practitioners like you definitely knew that retained afterbirth meant infection and death. You examine every piece carefully, looking for tears or missing sections that might indicate complications. This attention to detail, learned through watching women die from incomplete deliveries, probably saved more lives than any of your herbal remedies. By sunrise, you're washing blood from your hands and accepting a small payment of bread, cheese, and 2 silver coins, a generous fee that suggests the family genuinely appreciates your skill. Walking home through empty streets, you reflect on the night's work. Agnes and her baby survived, which puts you ahead of the statistical curve. But you know tomorrow might bring a different outcome. Your success rate hovers somewhere around 70% for routine deliveries, which actually isn't terrible considering your working conditions. But that means 3 out of every 10 births you attend ends with tragedy, and those failures haunt your dreams. You remember every woman who didn't make it, every baby who never drew breath, Every family whose celebration turned to mourning despite your best efforts. Medieval childbirth was essentially a lottery where death held too many winning tickets, and you were the person families called when they needed someone to improve their odds. Sometimes you succeeded through skill, sometimes through luck, and sometimes you just held hands with grieving relatives while another family learned that wanting something desperately doesn't guarantee receiving it. Back home, you clean your tools and replenish your herb supply, already mentally preparing for the next emergency call. Because there will be a next call, there's always another pregnant woman, another complicated delivery, another opportunity to roll the dice against death and see who wins this round. The irony of medieval midwifery is that everyone expects you to be an expert, but nobody actually teaches you how to do the job. Your medical education consists of watching other women work, hoping their techniques are correct, and praying that the folk remedies passed down through generations aren't complete nonsense. It's like learning brain surgery by standing in the back of an operating room and taking notes, except the operating room is someone's kitchen and the surgical instruments are whatever sharp objects you can find lying around. Your training began at age 12 when your mother decided you were old enough to witness birth without fainting or running away screaming. That first delivery remains burned into your memory not because it was particularly traumatic, but because it revealed how much of this profession involves educated guessing disguised as confident expertise. The laboring woman kept asking your mother what to do, and your mother kept giving decisive answers despite having no formal medical knowledge whatsoever. Medieval society operated on the assumption that women naturally understood childbirth because they possessed wombs, which is roughly equivalent to assuming all men are blacksmiths because they have muscles. Your actual qualifications consist of having female anatomy and not panicking when confronted with blood and screaming. The local priest blessed your calling, which apparently counts as professional certification in medieval times, though you suspect divine approval works better as a confidence booster than actual medical training. You learned technique through observation and experimentation, building your knowledge base one delivery at a time. Early in your career, you made mistakes that still wake you up at night, using herbs incorrectly, missing warning signs, trusting folklore that turned out to be dangerously wrong. But medieval malpractice lawsuits didn't exist, so you survived your learning curve and gradually developed genuine expertise through sheer trial and error. The apprenticeship system for midwifery was fascinatingly informal compared to other medieval trades. Blacksmiths had structured guild training, carpenters followed established learning progressions, but midwives simply appeared. You started accompanying your mother to births as a child, gradually taking on more responsibilities until one day you were handling deliveries independently. There was no ceremony, no official recognition, no moment when someone declared you qualified to practice. You just started catching babies and hoped for the best. Your first solo delivery happened when you were 15 and your mother was sick with fever. The messenger arrived at your door demanding immediate help, and you had two choices: attempt the birth alone or let both mother and baby die while searching for another midwife. You grabbed your mother's herb bag, whispered a desperate prayer, and discovered that months of observation had actually taught you more than you realized. The baby arrived safely, though you spent the entire labor fighting waves of panic and imposter syndrome. Medieval medical knowledge was passed down through an elaborate game of telephone, where each generation of midwives slightly modified the information they'd received. Your grandmother told your mother that certain herbs helped with difficult labors. Your mother taught you the same remedies with minor variations, and you'll eventually pass along your own slightly altered version to the next generation. It's remarkable that any useful knowledge survived this process intact. The herb garden behind your cottage represents years of accumulated pharmaceutical wisdom, though calling it pharmaceutical might be overly generous. You grow pennyroyal for inducing contractions, though too much can cause convulsions and death. There's foxglove for strengthening the heart during difficult labors, which actually works because it contains digitalis, though you won't learn that name for several centuries. Your prized belladonna plants help with pain, but the line between effective dose and lethal poisoning is thin enough to give you nightmares. Learning to cultivate and prepare these herbs required extensive trial and error, since medieval agricultural manuals focused on food crops rather than medicinal plants. You discovered through experience that pennyroyal harvested during the full moon was more potent, though you attributed this to lunar magic rather than the plant's natural chemical cycles. Your drying techniques, storage methods, and preparation rituals were developed through careful observation of what worked and what didn't. Medieval herbalism was basically chemistry without understanding atoms, molecules, or chemical reactions. You knew that certain plants produced certain effects, but your explanations for why involved theories about hot and cold humors, planetary influences, and divine intervention. Somehow, despite this complete absence of scientific framework, you managed to develop treatments that occasionally worked through pure empirical observation. Your most valuable reference book is a hand-copied manuscript your grandmother left you, filled with remedies written in a mixture of Latin phrases and local dialect. Half the pages are water-stained from years of emergency consultations during messy deliveries, and some remedies have been crossed out and rewritten based on your personal experience. It's like a medieval medical journal. If medical journals were written by people who thought illness was caused by angry spirits. The manuscript contains fascinating entries that reveal the evolution of medical knowledge through generations. One recipe for treating prolonged labor starts with the original Latin text recommending prayers to Saint Margaret, followed by your grandmother's addition suggesting ergot powder, then your mother's note about the proper dosage, and finally your own observations about which patients respond best to the treatment. It's a collaborative medical textbook spanning 3 generations of trial and error learning. The recipe for your signature labor-easing tea reads like a fantasy novel ingredient list. 3 parts dried raspberry leaf, 2 parts motherwort, 1 part blessed thistle, and a pinch of ground unicorn horn if the family can afford it. You brew this mixture during difficult labors, and it genuinely seems to help probably because raspberry leaf actually does tone uterine muscles, though you attribute its effectiveness to the blessing you whisper over each cup. Learning to identify herbs correctly was a life or death skill that you developed through careful observation and occasional terrifying mistakes. Early in your career, you confused hemlock with parsley and nearly poisoned a laboring woman before her sharp-eyed mother recognized your error. That incident taught you to triple-check every plant you harvested and to maintain a healthy paranoia about botanical identification. Medieval plant identification relied heavily on folklore and superstition rather than systematic botanical knowledge. You learned that devil's herbs grew in cursed soil and should be avoided, that plants picked during thunderstorms were more potent, and that certain flowers only bloomed for virtuous women. These beliefs were complete nonsense, but they served as memory devices for distinguishing between beneficial and harmful plants. Your diagnostic skills developed through pattern recognition rather than systematic training. You learned to read the signs of impending complications, the particular shade of gray that indicated dangerous blood loss, the quality of silence that meant a baby was in distress, the rhythm of contractions that suggested the labor was stalling. These observations accumulated over dozens of births until you developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when things were going wrong. Medieval medical texts, when they existed, were largely useless for practical midwifery. Most were written by male scholars who had never attended a birth and based their theories on ancient Greek and Roman sources rather than direct observation. You owned one such book, briefly a Latin treatise on women's medicine that suggested treating difficult labor by tying magnets to the patient's thighs and reciting specific prayers while facing east. You traded it for 2 good iron knives and some quality thread, which served you much better during actual emergencies. The physical techniques you use, manual version, cord management, placenta delivery were learned by watching experienced midwives work and then practicing during your own cases. Nobody explained the anatomy involved or the theoretical principles behind each procedure. You simply memorized the hand positions and hoped you could replicate them successfully when needed. It's remarkable that this apprenticeship system worked at all, considering how much could go catastrophically wrong. Your understanding of anatomy was charmingly incomplete. You knew that babies grew inside women's bodies and emerged through a specific opening, but the details of internal structure remained mysterious. Medieval people believed the womb was shaped like an upside-down jar and could wander around the body, causing various ailments. Your practical experience taught you that this was nonsense, but you had no alternative explanation for the complex anatomy you encountered during difficult deliveries. Historians still argue whether medieval midwives understood pregnancy and childbirth better than we give them credit for, but your daily experience suggests a mixture of surprising insight and complete ignorance. You knew that certain signs predicted difficult deliveries, but you explained them through astrological influences rather than medical causes. You had effective techniques for managing complications, but you attributed their success to prayer rather than skill. Your understanding of fetal development was fascinatingly incorrect. You believed babies were fully formed from conception, just very small, and pregnancy was simply a growing process like cultivating crops. The idea that organs developed gradually over months was completely foreign. You thought of unborn children as tiny, complete humans who just needed time to get bigger. This led to some interesting theories about when the soul entered the body and whether premature babies were fully human. Pain management was one area where your lack of training became genuinely problematic. You had access to alcohol, some opium-derived tinctures, and various herbs that provided mild relief, but nothing approaching effective anesthesia. Most laboring women simply endured whatever pain the process brought, supported by female relatives and whatever comfort you could provide through presence and reassurance. The idea that childbirth could be genuinely painless was literally unimaginable. Medieval pain relief techniques were creative, if not particularly effective. You learned to prepare poppy seed tea for extreme cases, though the dosage was pure guesswork and you risked accidentally overdosing patients. Some midwives used cold cloths soaked in wine to numb the birth canal, while others relied on distraction techniques like singing, storytelling, or having the laboring woman focus on religious imagery. These methods provided psychological comfort more than actual pain relief. Your surgical skills were limited to what you could manage with basic tools and no anesthesia. You could perform episiotomies using sharp knives, though you had no understanding of proper suturing techniques for repairs. Caesarean sections were theoretically possible but almost always fatal to the mother, reserved for situations where the baby might still be saved after maternal death. These procedures were performed by barber surgeons rather than midwives, since they required cutting through multiple tissue layers. The social aspects of your training were as important as the medical knowledge. You learned to manage family dynamics during stressful situations, navigate cultural expectations around birth rituals, and maintain authority in rooms full of panicking relatives. Medieval childbirth involved extensive community participation, so your job included crowd control along with actual medical care. Managing birth attendees required diplomatic skills that nobody taught you explicitly. You had to balance respecting family traditions with maintaining the sterile environment necessary for safe delivery, convince superstitious relatives to follow your instructions, and project confidence even when you had no idea what you were doing. These soft skills were crucial for successful practice, but you developed them entirely through experience. Religious training formed a crucial part of your education, though nobody called it that explicitly. You memorized prayers for different situations: safe delivery, complicated labor, dying mothers, stillborn babies. You knew which saints to invoke for specific problems and how to perform emergency baptisms for infants who might not survive. This spiritual component wasn't separate from medical care, it was integrated into every aspect of your practice. Your business skills were entirely self-taught, since nobody explained how to negotiate payments, maintain client relationships, or build a reputation in your community. You learned through experience that families in crisis would promise anything but might not pay once the emergency passed. You developed strategies for ensuring compensation and building long-term relationships with local families who needed your services repeatedly. The most valuable part of your training was developing emotional resilience. Nobody prepared you for watching young mothers die, holding stillborn babies, or comforting families whose hopes were destroyed in a single night. You learned to compartmentalize grief, maintain professional composure during tragedies, and process your own trauma without letting it interfere with future cases. This psychological preparation happened through exposure rather than guidance, leaving you to develop coping mechanisms independently. Looking back on your education, you realize how much you learned despite the complete absence of formal instruction. Your knowledge base grew organically through experience, observation, and necessity. You became genuinely skilled at managing childbirth complications, though you couldn't explain the scientific principles behind your techniques. Medieval midwifery was essentially advanced pattern recognition disguised as mystical expertise. And somehow, remarkably, it often worked. You live in a constant state of spiritual whiplash, trying to balance Christian doctrine with ancient birthing traditions that predate Christ by several centuries. The Church insists that childbirth pain is God's punishment for Eve's original sin, while your patient's grandmothers swear by pagan rituals involving moon phases and earth goddesses. You're essentially running a theological tightrope act where falling off either side could result in accusations of heresy, witchcraft, or both. Sunday morning finds you sitting in the wooden pew, listening to Father Benedict explain how women's suffering during labor reflects divine justice, while mentally cataloging which of his parishioners will probably need your services in the coming months. The irony isn't lost on you that the same church condemning female knowledge also expects you to save lives using techniques passed down through generations of women they consider spiritually inferior. It's like being told mathematics is evil while being hired to calculate tax collections. The official church position on childbirth is fascinatingly contradictory. Pain during labor is supposedly God's will and shouldn't be alleviated. But dead mothers and babies are also considered tragic losses that should be prevented. You're expected to help women survive delivery while not interfering with divine punishment, which creates some interesting theological gymnastics during difficult cases. Essentially, you're supposed to work miracles without actually performing miracles. Your birthing chamber becomes a fascinating battlefield between competing spiritual systems. You start each delivery with Christian prayers, invoking Saint Margaret and Saint and for protection, but you also quietly arrange iron nails around the room to ward off evil spirits, a practice that would horrify the local priest if he knew about it. Medieval women hedged their bets religiously, and you've learned to accommodate both their official faith and their unofficial superstitions. The ritual preparations for birth read like a religious syncretism textbook. You begin with holy water blessed by the priest, then add herbs gathered during specific moon phases according to ancient Celtic traditions. Christian crosses hang on the walls alongside protective amulets that definitely predate Christianity. You recite Latin prayers while burning herbs sacred to pre-Christian fertility goddesses, creating a spiritual atmosphere that would give theologians nightmares. Medieval Christianity had complicated relationships with female knowledge, especially regarding reproduction. The Church acknowledged that women possessed special understanding of childbirth after all. Men couldn't exactly claim expertise in areas they'd never experienced. But this same knowledge was viewed with suspicion, since it connected women to their bodies in ways that made celibate male clergy uncomfortable. You represented both divine blessing and potential temptation. The theological implications of your herbal knowledge create daily moral dilemmas. Every plant in your garden tells a story of competing religious traditions. Yarrow, which you used to stop bleeding, was sacred to the Germanic goddess Frigga before Christian missionaries renamed its healing properties as gifts from the Virgin Mary. Mugwort, essential for difficult labors, remains associated with pre-Christian moon worship despite centuries of attempted Christianization. You're essentially practicing herbalism with a pagan foundation disguised as Christian medicine. Your most potent labor-inducing remedy involves ergot fungus harvested from rye during the feast of St. John the Baptist, a Christian holiday that conveniently coincides with the summer solstice when ergot reaches peak potency. This timing isn't accidental. Medieval Christianity strategically placed feast days over existing pagan celebrations to ease religious transition. You benefit from this scheduling while navigating the complex theology it represents. The blessing rituals you perform during birth blend Christian and pagan elements so seamlessly that most participants don't notice the contradiction. You invoke the Trinity while arranging birthing stones in patterns that honor ancient earth spirits. Medieval women wanted every possible form of divine protection during labor, regardless of theological consistency, and you've learned to provide comprehensive spiritual coverage. Father Benedict represents the Church's ambivalent attitude toward your profession. He officially supports your life-saving work but privately worries about the methods you employ. During your monthly confession, he carefully avoids asking specific questions about your birthing rituals, and you carefully avoid volunteering information that might force him to take official action. This diplomatic dance allows both of you to maintain plausible deniability. The Church's teaching about women's spiritual nature creates constant professional complications. According to official doctrine, women are naturally more susceptible to demonic influence because of Eve's weakness in Eden. This makes your extensive knowledge of healing herbs and birthing mysteries automatically suspect. How did you acquire such powerful abilities without supernatural assistance? You've learned to attribute all successes to divine intervention rather than personal skill. Saint Margaret, your professional patron saint, represents an interesting compromise between Christian doctrine and practical needs. According to legend, she was swallowed by a dragon during martyrdom but burst free when the beast tried to digest her, making her an obvious choice for women hoping to deliver babies safely. The symbolism is hardly subtle, but it allows Christian women to pray for easy births while maintaining doctrinal correctness. Your most challenging theological moments involve what medieval people called monstrous births, babies born with physical deformities that contemporary society attributed to demonic influence or maternal sin. The Church taught that such births resulted from the mother's moral failings during pregnancy, while older traditions suggested supernatural interference. You find yourself counseling devastated families while navigating these competing explanations for tragedy. The seasonal timing of births creates fascinating intersections between Christian and pagan traditions. Medieval people believed that children conceived during specific religious festivals would inherit particular spiritual characteristics. Babies conceived during Easter would be blessed with divine protection, while those conceived during harvest festivals might possess unusual physical strength. You accommodate these beliefs by timing your fertility advice around both Christian and agricultural calendars. Historians still argue whether medieval midwives were genuinely Christian or simply performed Christian rituals to avoid persecution, but your personal experience suggests the distinction was largely meaningless. You believed in God's power to heal and protect, but you also believed in the effectiveness of pre-Christian practices your grandmother taught you. Medieval spirituality was fascinatingly syncretic, blending traditions without worrying about theological purity. The Church's evolving position on pain relief during childbirth creates ongoing professional dilemmas. Early Christian doctrine insisted that labor pain was divinely mandated punishment, but practical experience showed that women who suffered less were more likely to survive delivery. You've developed techniques for providing relief while maintaining the appearance of accepting God's will, essentially performing theological sleight of hand during medical emergencies. Birth attendees often request rituals that put you in impossible theological positions. Families want you to perform protective ceremonies that involve burying placentas under threshold stones, hanging iron charms in specific patterns, or timing deliveries according to astrological calculations. These practices clearly violate Christian doctrine, but refusing them might mean losing patients to midwives more willing to accommodate traditional beliefs. Your collection of protective prayers reflects this complex religious heritage. Some invocations are purely Christian, calling upon Jesus, Mary, and various saints for protection during delivery. Others blend Christian language with much older formulas that originally addressed pre-Christian deities. You've memorized dozens of these hybrid prayers, selecting appropriate versions based on each family's religious sensibilities and cultural background. The most contentious spiritual issue you face involves emergency baptisms for dying newborns. Church law clearly states that women cannot perform sacraments, but practical necessity demands immediate action when babies are born near death. You've developed a workaround involving conditional baptisms, performing the ritual while stating that it's only valid if no properly ordained priest is available. This theological loophole satisfies canonical requirements while ensuring infants' souls reach heaven. Medieval women's approach to childbirth spirituality was remarkably pragmatic and syncretic. The same woman might wear a Christian cross, carry pagan fertility amulets, and request both Latin prayers and ancient Celtic blessings during labor. You've learned to provide whatever spiritual comfort each patient needs, regardless of theological consistency. Results matter more than religious purity when lives hang in the balance. Your herbal preparations often require gathering plants during specific religious observances, creating complex scheduling challenges. St. John's wort must be harvested on the feast day of St. John the Baptist for maximum potency, but this timing conflicts with the summer solstice when pagan traditions insisted the plant was most powerful. You've solved this problem by recognizing that medieval Christianity deliberately placed St. John's feast during the solstice, allowing you to honor both traditions simultaneously. The protective amulets and charms you recommend walk careful lines between Christian acceptability and practical effectiveness. Holy relics blessed by priests provide unquestionable spiritual protection, but they're expensive and rare. More affordable alternatives include iron nails arranged in cross patterns, herbs gathered during Easter week, and prayer beads made from specific wood types. These items offer spiritual comfort without obviously violating church doctrine. Your relationship with local wise women creates additional theological complications. Many of your most effective techniques come from elderly women whose knowledge predates Christian influence in your region. These teachers are often viewed with suspicion by church authorities, who worry about their connections to pre-Christian traditions. You maintain these relationships carefully, learning valuable skills while avoiding guilt by association. The evolution of birthing traditions reflects broader cultural changes as Christianity gradually absorbed local customs. Practices that were once explicitly pagan have been reinterpreted through Christian symbolism, allowing their continuation under new religious frameworks. You participate in this cultural transformation, helping preserve ancient wisdom while adapting it to contemporary theological requirements. Medieval Christianity's attitude toward female healing knowledge was simultaneously appreciative and suspicious. The Church recognized that women possessed valuable medical skills, especially regarding childbirth and infant care, but worried about the sources of this knowledge. Your expertise could be viewed as divine gift or demonic influence, depending on political circumstances and current theological trends. The most effective spiritual practices you've developed combine Christian and pagan elements so thoroughly that separating them would be impossible. Your ritual for blessing birthing chambers involves holy water, Christian prayers, protective herbs, and geometric arrangements that definitely predate Christianity. Medieval women found these hybrid ceremonies deeply comforting, and you've learned that spiritual comfort translates into better birth outcomes. Managing these competing religious demands requires diplomatic skills that nobody taught you explicitly. You've learned to read family preferences quickly, adjusting your spiritual approach to match their comfort levels. Some households want purely Christian ceremonies, others prefer traditional practices, and many want combinations that would horrify both priests and ancient pagans. Your job involves providing appropriate spiritual atmosphere for each situation. The theological tensions in your profession mirror larger struggles within medieval society about the role of women's knowledge, the validity of traditional practices, and the relationship between official doctrine and practical needs. You've learned to navigate these complex waters by focusing on results rather than ideological purity, saving lives while maintaining spiritual credibility across multiple religious traditions. Your success in balancing Christian orthodoxy with practical paganism demonstrates the remarkable flexibility of medieval religious practice. Despite official church teaching about theological purity, actual believers were remarkably willing to blend traditions when circumstances demanded it. You've become an expert in this religious syncretism, creating spiritual frameworks that satisfy both doctrinal requirements and practical needs. Your herb garden is essentially a medieval pharmacy where every prescription is a potentially lethal game of chance. You stand among rows of plants that could either save a laboring woman's life or accidentally poison her entire family, armed with nothing but generational folklore and an alarming amount of wishful thinking. Medieval pharmacology operated on the principle that if small amounts of something helped, larger amounts must help more, a theory that explained why so many of your colleagues had impressively short careers. The morning routine of preparing herbal remedies reads like a recipe for disaster written by someone with a gambling addiction. You measure pennyroyal extract by counting drops, knowing that 3 drops might ease labor pains while 6 drops could trigger fatal convulsions. Your foxglove preparations require such precise dosing that you've developed your own measurement system based on fingernail-sized portions, because medieval apothecary weights apparently weren't designed for substances that could stop hearts. Every plant in your collection tells a story of trial and error learning, often with emphasis on the error part. Your grandmother's notes include helpful warnings like, too much henbane caused Margaret's daughter to see demons for 3 days, and vervain mixed with ale made the baker's wife sleep for 2 weeks. These cautionary tales represent generations of women discovering through unfortunate experience exactly how much botanical medicine human bodies could tolerate. Medieval herbalism was essentially advanced chemistry practiced by people who thought atoms were a philosophical concept rather than actual particles. You understood that certain plant combinations produced specific effects, but your explanations involved theories about hot and cold humors, planetary influences, and divine intervention. Somehow, despite this complete absence of scientific framework, you managed to develop treatments that occasionally worked through pure empirical observation. Your most challenging pharmaceutical decisions involve ergot fungus, which grows on rye and serves as your most powerful labor-inducing medication. In proper doses, ergot causes strong uterine contractions that can save women from prolonged, dangerous deliveries. In excessive amounts, it triggers gangrene, hallucinations, and death side effects that medieval people attributed to demonic possession rather than alkaloid poisoning. You've learned to recognize ergot-induced psychosis, though you explain it as temporary spiritual affliction rather than pharmaceutical overdose. The storage and preservation of medicinal herbs requires knowledge that nobody taught you systematically. You discovered through expensive mistakes that mugwort loses potency if exposed to direct sunlight, that dried pennyroyal must be stored in sealed containers to prevent contamination, and that ground unicorn horn actually narwhal tusk powder maintains effectiveness longer when mixed with blessed salt. These storage techniques were developed through careful observation of what worked and what produced mysteriously ineffective remedies. Historians still argue whether medieval midwives understood the actual mechanisms behind their herbal treatments, but your daily experience suggests a complex mixture of accurate observation and completely incorrect interpretation. You knew that willow bark tea reduced fever and pain, but you attributed its effectiveness to the tree's connection with water spirits rather than its salicylic acid content. Your remedies often worked despite rather than because of your theoretical understanding. Your preparation rituals for complex remedies blend pharmaceutical necessity with spiritual insurance policies. Brewing labor-easing tea requires precise timing, specific water temperatures, and careful attention to steeping duration, all legitimate pharmaceutical concerns. But you also insist on grinding herbs during particular moon phases, blessing each ingredient with appropriate prayers, and adding drops of holy water to enhance divine protection. Medieval medicine was equal parts chemistry and faith healing. The most dangerous aspect of your pharmaceutical practice involves dosage calculations based on medieval measurement systems that would horrify modern pharmacists. You measure liquid remedies using spoons that vary in size depending on who crafted them, estimate powder amounts based on pinch sizes that depend on finger thickness, and time brewing processes using prayers of inconsistent length. It's remarkable that anyone survived medieval medicine, considering the complete absence of standardized measurements. Your antidote collection represents years of learning from other midwives' poisoning accidents. You keep activated charcoal for general toxin absorption, though you call it blessed black earth, and attribute its effectiveness to divine purification properties. Milk thistle seeds counter liver damage from excessive herb consumption, while strong coffee when available helps reverse dangerous sedation. These antidotes were discovered through unfortunate trial and error rather than systematic toxicology research. The economic pressures of maintaining an herbal pharmacy create constant temptations to cut corners on quality and safety. High-grade unicorn horn costs more than most families earn in months, encouraging substitution with cheaper alternatives like ground cattle bones or chalk powder. You've learned to distinguish genuine medicinal ingredients from fraudulent substitutes, but the knowledge came through expensive mistakes that sometimes cost patients their lives. Medieval herb gathering follows elaborate protocols that combine practical necessity with spiritual protection. You harvest mugwort during dawn hours when dew concentrates the plant's active compounds, though you explain this timing as capturing lunar essence before sunrise disperses it. Foxglove must be gathered while wearing gloves to prevent skin absorption, but you tell people it's to avoid offending the plant spirits that govern its healing power. Your most complex pharmaceutical preparations require ingredients from multiple climatic regions, creating supply chain challenges that would frustrate modern logistics experts. Cinnamon bark from distant spice routes costs more than silver. Myrrh resin requires trading relationships with Mediterranean merchants, and exotic herb seeds might take years to arrive through unreliable medieval commerce networks. You've learned to substitute local alternatives when possible, though the results are often unpredictably different. The seasonal aspects of herbal medicine force you to plan pharmaceutical production months in advance. Spring herbs must be gathered, processed, and stored to last through winter when fresh alternatives aren't available. You spend summer months preparing tinctures, drying plant materials, and creating concentrated extracts that will remain potent during cold seasons when pregnant women still need medical care. Medieval midwifery required extensive project management skills that nobody mentioned during your informal training. Quality control in medieval pharmacy depended entirely on sensory evaluation and patient feedback. You assessed herb potency by examining color, testing aroma intensity, and monitoring how quickly dried materials crumbled when crushed. Patient responses provided crucial data about dosage effectiveness, though separating pharmaceutical effects from placebo responses was impossible without controlled testing methods that wouldn't be invented for centuries. Your most frightening pharmaceutical moments involve emergency antidote administration when standard remedies trigger unexpected reactions. Medieval people had widely varying tolerances for herbal medicines, and what helped one patient might poison another. You've learned to recognize signs of botanical overdose: pale skin, irregular heartbeat, excessive drowsiness, or unusual agitation and respond quickly with neutralizing treatments. These emergency interventions required split-second decision-making based on incomplete information. The psychological aspects of herbal treatment were as important as the pharmaceutical components. Medieval patients expected their medicines to taste terrible, smell unusual, and produce noticeable physical effects. Pleasant-tasting remedies were often considered weak or fraudulent, while dramatically bitter preparations suggested powerful healing potential. You've learned to balance actual medicinal effectiveness with patient expectations about how serious medicine should affect their bodies. Your herbal pharmacy operates within a complex web of legal and religious restrictions that change depending on local politics and church influence. Some herbs are considered acceptable Christian medicine, while others carry suspicions of pagan association or demonic enhancement. You've learned to disguise questionable ingredients using Christian names, calling henbane St. Peter's herb, or referring to belladonna as Virgin's nightshade to avoid theological complications. The most valuable pharmaceutical knowledge you possess involves recognizing individual patient responses to different herbal treatments. Medieval people varied dramatically in their tolerance for specific plant medicines, and successful practice required adapting remedies to individual constitutions. You've developed patient profiles noting who responds well to ergot preparations, who requires reduced dosages of sedating herbs, and who should avoid certain plant families entirely. Medieval pharmaceutical education happened through apprenticeship relationships with experienced practitioners, though education might overstate the systematic nature of this knowledge transfer. You learned dosage guidelines by watching other midwives work, memorized preparation techniques through repetitive practice, and discovered antidote protocols through emergency situations that required immediate improvisation. This learning process was remarkably inefficient but occasionally produced genuinely skilled practitioners. Your success rate with herbal treatments hovers around 60% for routine applications, which actually represents impressive pharmaceutical achievement considering your working conditions. Medieval medicine operated without understanding of individual biochemistry, drug interactions, or dose-response relationships, yet experienced practitioners like you managed to help more patients than they harmed. This success came through careful observation, conservative dosing, and extensive experience with human responses to plant-based medicines. The evolution of your pharmaceutical practice reflects broader changes in medieval medicine as classical knowledge slowly merged with local folk traditions. Your techniques blend Roman herbal medicine, Germanic plant lore, and Celtic healing practices into hybrid treatments that draw from multiple cultural sources. You represent a living example of how medical knowledge spreads, adapts, and evolves through practical application rather than theoretical study. Looking back on your pharmaceutical education, you realize how much genuine medical knowledge you've accumulated despite the complete absence of scientific framework for understanding why your treatments work. Your herbal garden represents decades of careful experimentation, patient observation, and accumulated wisdom about plant-based healing. Medieval pharmacy was essentially applied chemistry disguised as folk magic, and somehow, remarkably, it often produced genuinely beneficial results. You practice medicine in a society where the line between healing and witchcraft depends entirely on whether your patient survives, making every delivery a potential trial by ordeal where failure could literally mean burning at the stake. Medieval witch hunts haven't reached their horrifying peak yet, but the groundwork is definitely being laid, and your profession sits squarely in the crosshairs of religious paranoia and social suspicion. You're essentially playing Russian roulette with public opinion every time you successfully treat a difficult case. The signs that you might be heading toward accusation are subtle but terrifying. Neighbors start crossing themselves when you walk past, children are pulled indoors when you approach, and conversations suddenly stop when you enter the marketplace. These social indicators suggest that someone has been spreading rumors about your methods, questioning whether your impressive success rate comes from divine blessing or demonic assistance. Medieval people found supernatural explanations more comfortable than admitting that women might possess genuine medical expertise. Your most dangerous moments come after particularly dramatic saves, when families spread stories about your miraculous interventions that sound suspiciously like supernatural interference. Last month, you delivered a baby that everyone assumed was stillborn, but careful mouth-to-mouth resuscitation brought the child back to life. The grateful family praised your life-saving skills throughout the village, but their enthusiasm backfired when neighbors began wondering how exactly you'd commanded a dead soul to return to its body. Medieval society operated on the assumption that extraordinary medical success required extraordinary explanations. When you correctly predicted that the baker's wife would have twins based on the size and shape of her belly, people whispered about prophetic abilities that might come from demonic sources. When your herbal remedies consistently worked better than other midwives' treatments, neighbors questioned whether you'd made supernatural bargains to enhance your effectiveness. Success bred suspicion in communities where failure was considered normal. The church's attitude toward your profession oscillates between appreciation and suspicion depending on current theological trends and political pressures. Father Benedict publicly supports your work saving lives during childbirth, but you've noticed him asking increasingly pointed questions about your methods during confession. He's particularly interested in your herbal knowledge. How did you learn which plants help with difficult deliveries? And who taught you to combine them so effectively? Medieval witch accusations often began with medical practice that seemed too successful or too mysterious for contemporary understanding. Your ability to predict difficult deliveries by reading subtle physical signs looks like supernatural foresight to people unfamiliar with diagnostic techniques. Your herbal remedies work reliably enough to suggest otherworldly assistance, and your calm confidence during emergencies implies knowledge that might have come from non-human sources. The economic aspects of your situation create additional vulnerability to supernatural accusations. Your medical practice generates significantly more income than most women could earn through traditional medieval occupations, creating resentment and suspicion about the sources of your prosperity. Neighbors wondered whether your wealth came from honest medical fees or supernatural assistance in acquiring gold and valuable goods through demonic contracts. Medieval people believed that witches could manipulate natural processes in ways that enhanced their economic success, causing neighbors' crops to fail while improving their own harvests, influencing market prices through supernatural means, or discovering hidden treasures through demonic guidance. Your comfortable lifestyle and growing savings made you a target for people seeking explanations for their own economic struggles and personal tragedies. The most dangerous aspect of your situation involves the political dynamics of witch accusations in medieval communities. Local tensions often express themselves through supernatural allegations, and successful women like you made convenient targets for neighbors seeking scapegoats for their own problems. Your growing reputation and increasing wealth from medical practice created resentment among families struggling with poverty, failed harvests, or personal tragedies they needed someone to blame. Your defensive strategies involve carefully managing public perception while maintaining the professional effectiveness that keeps you in demand. You emphasize prayer and religious devotion during all medical procedures, loudly attribute successes to divine intervention rather than personal skill, and make generous donations to church construction projects. These tactics provide spiritual insurance against accusations while demonstrating Orthodox Christian faith to skeptical neighbors. The specific accusations that terrify you most involve claims about supernatural knowledge acquisition. Medieval people couldn't explain how women learned complex medical techniques without formal education, so they assumed the information came from demonic sources. Your extensive herbal knowledge, diagnostic abilities, and surgical techniques all suggested supernatural tutoring to people unfamiliar with generational knowledge transfer through female networks. Historians still argue whether medieval witch hunts primarily targeted genuinely skilled practitioners or simply vulnerable women who made convenient scapegoats, but your experience suggests both dynamics operated simultaneously. You've noticed that the most competent midwives in neighboring villages tend to face more supernatural allegations than their less effective colleagues, while poor widows and social outcasts get accused regardless of their actual abilities. Your herbalism creates particular vulnerability because medieval people associated plant knowledge with ancient pagan traditions that predated Christianity. The fact that you knew which fungi helped with difficult labors, how to prepare tinctures that eased pain, and when to harvest plants for maximum potency suggested connections to pre-Christian wisdom that made religious authorities nervous. You were practicing medicine that looked suspiciously like nature magic to people unfamiliar with botanical science. The social isolation that comes with which suspicion affects every aspect of your professional practice. Families who desperately need your services hesitate to call for help, worried that association with you might bring supernatural attention to their households. You've lost several regular patients whose relatives convinced them that your successful treatments came at too high a spiritual cost. Fear spreads faster than medical reputation in medieval communities. Your most terrifying close call happened when young Thomas, the miller's son, died of fever 3 days after you'd delivered his mother's latest baby. The timing was purely coincidental. Childhood illnesses were tragically common in medieval times, but grieving relatives needed someone to blame for their loss. Whispers began circulating about suspicious timing, questioning whether you'd cursed the family during the birth or performed rituals that attracted evil influences to their household. The investigation that followed revealed how quickly supernatural accusations could spiral beyond control in medieval communities. The local priest interviewed family members about unusual events surrounding the birth. Neighbors reported strange lights and sounds from your cottage, and someone claimed they'd seen you gathering herbs during a thunderstorm, behavior that suggested demonic weather magic to people who believed witches controlled natural phenomena. Medieval people interpreted coincidence as evidence and correlation as causation when evaluating supernatural allegations. The fact that Thomas fell ill shortly after your visit was considered proof of malevolent influence, even though you'd had no contact with the child and his symptoms matched known seasonal illnesses. Your professional success became evidence against you, since effective medicine was considered inherently suspicious without divine explanation. Your survival strategy during that crisis involved a careful campaign of religious demonstration and community service. You spent extra time at church services, volunteered for religious festivals, and provided free medical care to demonstrate Christian charity. Most importantly, you enlisted the support of families whose lives you'd saved, creating a network of character witnesses who could testify to your godly behavior and beneficial work. The legal procedures for investigating witchcraft varied by region but generally favored accusers over defendants, making any formal charges extremely dangerous regardless of their validity. Medieval justice systems assumed that supernatural crimes were inherently difficult to prove through normal evidence, justifying the use of torture, trial by ordeal, and testimony from questionable witnesses. You've heard enough horror stories to know that innocent women rarely survived formal witch trials, the psychological pressure of which suspicion manifests in unexpected ways throughout your daily routine. You find yourself avoiding behaviors that might be interpreted as suspicious, no longer gathering herbs during unusual weather, eliminating traditional protective rituals from your practice, and suppressing the confident demeanor that once helped calm anxious patients. The constant self-monitoring required to appear sufficiently ordinary is mentally exhausting. Your relationships with other women in similar professions provided both support and additional danger. The midwife network that shared knowledge and techniques also created guilt by association when one member faced witch accusations. You've watched talented practitioners flee their communities rather than risk trials that rarely ended well for the accused, leaving behind years of carefully built medical practice and professional relationships. The religious tests that communities sometimes imposed on suspected witches created ongoing anxiety about your spiritual authenticity. You needed to demonstrate perfect familiarity with Christian prayers, show appropriate reverence during religious ceremonies, and display knowledge of theological concepts that weren't typically taught to women. Your spiritual education became a form of life insurance against supernatural accusations that could destroy your career and your life. Medieval witch paranoia often focused on women's knowledge of reproductive medicine because fertility and childbirth were considered inherently mysterious processes that might involve supernatural influences. Your expertise in managing difficult deliveries, predicting birth complications, and influencing labor outcomes through herbal interventions placed you in a professional category that communities viewed with simultaneous gratitude and suspicion. The environmental factors that increased witch suspicion included natural disasters, crop failures, unusual weather patterns, and epidemic diseases that communities needed to explain through supernatural causation. During these crisis periods, your medical practice became more dangerous because people sought scapegoats for their suffering, and successful healers made convenient targets for frustrated anger and grief. Your contingency planning involves maintaining escape routes and emergency resources in case accusations progress toward formal charges. You keep a hidden cache of gold coins, valuable herbs, and essential tools that could sustain you during flight from your community. You've also cultivated relationships with midwives in distant villages who might provide sanctuary if local suspicions became too dangerous to ignore. The most insidious aspect of witch paranoia involves how it corrupts the therapeutic relationships essential for effective medical practice. Patients who fear supernatural contamination become reluctant to follow your instructions. Family members watch for signs of unnatural behavior during deliveries, and successful treatments generate suspicion rather than gratitude. The very competence that makes you valuable as a midwife also makes you dangerous as a potential witch. Medieval communities developed elaborate systems for monitoring suspected witches that affected every aspect of daily life. Neighbors watched for unusual animal behavior around your cottage, tracked your movements during significant religious holidays, and reported any activities that seemed inconsistent with normal female behavior. This surveillance created a climate of perpetual anxiety that influenced your professional choices and personal relationships. The economic incentives behind which accusations often involved property confiscation and debt forgiveness that made supernatural allegations financially attractive for certain community members. Successful prosecution could result in seizure of your assets, cancellation of debts owed to you, and redistribution of your medical practice to other practitioners. These material motivations disguise themselves as spiritual concerns about community protection. Your professional legacy depends on navigating these supernatural allegations successfully while maintaining the medical effectiveness that justifies the risks involved. Medieval midwifery required not only medical knowledge and technical skill, but also political acumen and theatrical ability to survive in communities where healing expertise could be interpreted as demonic collaboration. You've learned that saving lives isn't enough. You must save them in ways that look sufficiently ordinary to avoid supernatural suspicion. The broader cultural context of your witch trial anxieties reflects changing medieval attitudes toward women's knowledge, religious orthodoxy, and social control. You represent a transitional period when traditional female healing practices were becoming increasingly suspect as formal medical institutions developed and religious authorities sought to eliminate competing sources of spiritual authority. Delivering babies for nobility is like performing surgery while balancing on a tightrope suspended over a pit of executioners. One wrong move and you're not just losing a patient, you're losing your head. When Lady Isabel de Montfort goes into labor, you're summoned to the castle with the understanding that her survival equals your continued existence, while her death equals a very public and unpleasant demonstration of medieval justice. It's essentially medical practice with the ultimate performance pressure, where failure isn't just professionally embarrassing, it's literally fatal. The summons arrives at dawn with a mounted messenger whose urgency suggests that you're expected to work miracles on demand. Lady Isabel has been laboring for 2 days without progress, and the court physicians, those university-trained men with their theoretical knowledge and complete lack of practical obstetric experience, have declared the situation beyond their expertise. You're being called in as the last resort, which means you get both the impossible cases and the blame when ancient medical theory fails to save lives. Your journey to the castle provides unwelcome time to contemplate the political implications of this delivery. Lady Isabel is carrying the heir to significant land holdings, and her husband's family has been feuding with neighboring lords over territorial disputes that could escalate into armed conflict. The baby's survival determines inheritance rights worth more than entire villages, while the mother's death could destabilize regional power structures that affect thousands of people. Medieval noble births were political events disguised as medical emergencies, where your clinical decisions carried diplomatic consequences that extended far beyond the birthing chamber. The sex of the baby, its physical condition, and the mother's survival all influenced succession laws, marriage alliances, and military strategies that you couldn't begin to understand. You're essentially practicing obstetrics in the middle of a chess game played by people who could have you executed for disrupting their plans. The castle's birthing chamber has been prepared with every luxury medieval wealth could provide, yet it remains fundamentally inadequate for managing serious obstetric complications. Silk hangings and golden vessels look impressive, but don't improve your ability to perform manual procedures or provide effective pain relief. The expensive imported incense burns continuously to purify the air, though it mostly creates choking smoke that makes breathing difficult for everyone involved. Court protocol requires you to work under the supervision of male physicians whose medical training consisted entirely of reading ancient texts rather than attending actual births. These learned gentlemen hover around offering theoretical advice based on Greek and Roman medical theory, while you deal with the practical reality of a transverse presentation that threatens both mother and child. It's like having literature professors explain engineering to a bridge builder during structural collapse. The political pressure becomes unbearable when you realize that Lady Isabel's pregnancy represents her third attempt to produce a male heir after 2 previous daughters. Medieval succession laws strongly favored sons, and her husband's patience with female offspring has apparently reached its limit. Court whispers suggest that failure to deliver a healthy boy might result in annulment proceedings that would destroy Lady Isabel's social position and potentially end your career. Your examination reveals the worst possible scenario. The baby is presenting shoulder first and appears unusually large for Lady Isabel's narrow pelvis. Attempting internal version carries significant risks of uterine rupture, while allowing labor to continue naturally will almost certainly result in maternal death from exhaustion and bleeding. Every option involves substantial mortality risk, but doing nothing guarantees tragedy. The court physicians recommend bloodletting to balance Lady Isabel's humors, a treatment that would weaken her further during an already dangerous situation. You politely disagree while privately wondering how these men earned medical degrees without understanding that blood loss during childbirth is generally counterproductive. Medieval academic medicine was fascinatingly disconnected from clinical reality, especially regarding women's health issues that male scholars couldn't experience personally. Historians still argue whether medieval court physicians genuinely believed their theoretical treatments would help patients or simply perform them to maintain professional credibility. But your experience suggests most honestly thought bloodletting and herbal purges represented cutting-edge medical intervention. The gap between university training and practical obstetrics was so vast that educated physicians often caused more harm than untrained midwives. Your decision to attempt manual version requires clearing the chamber of most observers, since the procedure involves intimate contact that court etiquette would normally prohibit. Lady Isabel's ladies-in-waiting protest that leaving her alone with a commoner midwife violates social protocol, but her husband overrules their objections when you explain that spectators increase infection risk and compromise your ability to work effectively. The internal version procedure becomes a nightmare of political and medical pressure combined. Lady Isabel screams continuously while you work to rotate the baby into proper position, her cries echoing through stone corridors where every court member waits to learn whether their political futures remain secure. You can feel the baby's heartbeat growing weaker as prolonged labor compromises its oxygen supply, adding time pressure to an already impossible situation. Medieval pain management for noble patients involved imported wines mixed with exotic opium preparations that cost more than annual peasant incomes, but even luxury pharmaceuticals couldn't eliminate the agony of manual obstetric procedures. Lady Isabel endures the manipulation with remarkable courage. Though her suffering becomes another source of political anxiety, court observers might interpret excessive pain as evidence of supernatural interference or divine punishment. Your success in turning the baby triggers immediate relief followed by fresh anxiety as you realize the child will be born blue and apparently lifeless. Court protocol requires immediate determination of the baby's sex and survival status, since inheritance laws depend on producing living male heirs rather than deceased children of either gender. You have moments to perform resuscitation while political futures hang in the balance. The baby's first cry transforms the chamber's atmosphere from funeral solemnity to celebration, though your relief is tempered by awareness that the child's long-term survival remains uncertain. Medieval infant mortality rates meant that successful delivery was only the first hurdle in producing viable heirs, and you could still face blame if the baby develops complications during its crucial first weeks of life. Lady Isabel's delivery of the placenta proceeds normally, but you notice concerning amounts of bleeding that require immediate intervention. Court physicians recommend additional bloodletting to balance postpartum humors, while you quietly apply pressure and herbal preparations to control hemorrhaging. Your treatments work effectively, but you must present them as supporting the physician's theoretical approaches rather than contradicting their medical authority. The baby's examination reveals a healthy male heir with no obvious physical abnormalities, news that generates immediate celebration throughout the castle and probably prevents several diplomatic crises. Court messengers depart immediately to announce the birth to allied families, while scribes begin recording the event for official chronicles that will document your role in preserving regional political stability. Your payment for this delivery includes not only substantial gold coins, but also formal protection letters that shield you from local persecution and guarantee safe passage through noble territories. These documents represent life insurance against which accusations or political conflicts that might threaten your practice, though they also create obligations to provide medical services during future noble emergencies. The social elevation that comes with successfully delivering noble heirs creates new professional pressures and opportunities. Other aristocratic families request your services based on your court reputation, but each case carries similar life or death consequences for both patients and yourself. Success builds your practice while failure could result in execution, exile, or permanent loss of professional credibility. Medieval noble medical practice required navigating complex court politics that could change rapidly based on inheritance disputes, marriage alliances, and military conflicts beyond your control or understanding. Your clinical decisions affected power structures spanning multiple generations, making every delivery a potential catalyst for regional instability that you couldn't predict or prevent. The psychological stress of practicing medicine under constant threat of execution takes a significant toll on your mental health and professional confidence. You find yourself second-guessing clinical decisions based on political rather than medical considerations, wondering whether certain treatments might be interpreted as favoritism toward particular court factions or attempts to influence succession outcomes. Your reputation as a noble birth specialist creates expectations that you can guarantee successful outcomes regardless of medical circumstances. Court families assume that higher payments ensure better results, failing to understand that obstetric complications don't respect social hierarchies or financial investments. You become responsible for managing unrealistic expectations while dealing with the same biological realities that affect peasant births. The most dangerous aspect of noble obstetric practice involves the intersection of medical outcomes with religious interpretation. Failed deliveries might be attributed to divine judgment on family sins, supernatural interference from political enemies, or insufficient spiritual preparation rather than biological complications. Your medical expertise becomes entangled with theological debates that could result in charges of heresy or witchcraft. Looking back on your court experiences, you realize that noble birth attendance represents both the pinnacle of medieval midwifery practice and its most perilous application. The combination of advanced medical challenges, political pressure, and life-threatening consequences creates a professional environment where success brings wealth and prestige while failure brings destruction. You've learned to practice medicine as a form of high-stakes diplomacy where clinical skill must be balanced against political survival instincts. You continue practicing midwifery during the Black Death, because apparently someone decided that catching babies during history's most devastating pandemic would make an excellent career choice. While everyone else barricades themselves indoors and prays for divine intervention, you're still making house calls to deliver babies into a world where the mortality rate has become a statistical horror show. It's like being the only lifeguard at a beach where the water is on fire, except the fire is invisible and might kill you through casual contact. The plague arrives in your village like an unwelcome dinner guest who never leaves and gradually murders your entire household. First, you notice fewer people at market, then entire families disappear, and finally you're walking through streets where half the houses stand empty with doors marked by crude crosses. The birth rate hasn't decreased proportionally. Medieval people apparently maintained optimistic attitudes about reproduction even during apocalyptic events, so you're busier than ever delivering babies into increasingly uncertain circumstances. Your medical knowledge proves utterly useless against the plague, which operates according to rules that medieval medicine can't begin to comprehend. All your herbal remedies, bloodletting techniques, and spiritual interventions are completely ineffective against a bacterial infection that won't be understood for another 6 centuries. You watch helplessly as people you've known for years develop the telltale buboes and die within days, regardless of their age, health, or moral character. Medieval plague prevention consisted mostly of avoiding bad air, carrying protective amulets, and praying more frequently, strategies that worked about as well as you'd expect against Yersinia pestis. You wear garlic around your neck, burn special incense during births, and splash vinegar on everything, none of which provides actual protection but at least makes you feel like you're taking precautions. It's medieval medicine at its most desperately ineffective. The social breakdown caused by mass mortality creates unprecedented challenges for your profession. Traditional support networks collapse when entire extended families die within weeks, leaving pregnant women without the female relatives who normally assisted during labor. You find yourself not only delivering babies but also providing all the postpartum care that communities once shared among multiple generations of experienced women. The first plague case you encounter personally involves Margaret, the Cooper's wife, who develops fever and swollen lymph nodes 3 days after giving birth to her 4th child. Medieval people called the plague symptoms God's tokens and considered them death sentences. But you continue providing postpartum care because abandoning patients violated every professional principle you'd learned. Margaret dies within a week, leaving behind a newborn who somehow remains healthy despite intimate contact with infected mother's milk. Childbirth during plague times becomes an exercise in existential horror, as families struggle to celebrate new life while surrounded by omnipresent death. You deliver healthy babies to mothers who might not survive the next month, and you help women through labor while their husbands dig graves for plague victims in the backyard. The psychological atmosphere makes every birth feel like a desperate act of defiance against cosmic injustice. Your workload increases dramatically as other midwives succumb to plague or flee to regions where infection rates remain lower. You're covering territory that once required 3 or 4 practitioners, traveling between scattered communities where surviving residents desperately need medical services. The physical exhaustion combines with constant fear of infection to create working conditions that no modern labor union would tolerate. Medieval transportation during plague outbreaks becomes a logistical nightmare of quarantine restrictions and travel prohibitions. Villages establish roadblocks to prevent infected travelers from entering their territories, forcing you to negotiate passage through hostile checkpoints where guards might refuse entry regardless of medical emergencies. You carry letters from local authorities certifying your essential status, though their effectiveness depends on the literacy and cooperation of whoever controls each barrier. The economic aspects of practicing during plague create ethical dilemmas that keep you awake at night. Surviving families often have significant wealth accumulated from deceased relatives, making them able to pay premium fees for medical services. But charging desperate people higher rates during catastrophic circumstances feels morally questionable, even when your own survival depends on accumulating resources for uncertain times ahead. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practitioners understood disease transmission well enough to take effective precautions, but your daily experience suggests that most people recognize plague's contagious nature without understanding the mechanisms involved. You wash your hands more frequently, avoid close contact when possible, and change clothing after attending plague households, though you attribute these practices to spiritual purification rather than bacterial prevention. Your most terrifying professional moments involve attending births in households where plague has already appeared. You deliver babies while family members lie dying in adjacent rooms, creating situations where new life and imminent death occupy the same physical space. These deliveries require emotional compartmentalization that pushes human psychological resilience to its absolute limits. The spiritual crisis caused by plague challenges every aspect of medieval religious belief, including the theological frameworks that supported your profession. If God controls all events, why would He allow such comprehensive destruction of Christian communities? If prayer and righteous living provide protection, why do virtuous families die while corrupt merchants survive? These questions undermine the spiritual foundations that previously justified your medical practice. Medieval plague medicine was essentially educated guesswork applied to a phenomenon that exceeded contemporary understanding by several centuries. You try bloodletting, herbal treatments, and various surgical interventions on plague patients, but nothing works consistently enough to suggest effective therapy. The randomness of survival versus death makes medical practice feel like elaborate ritual performed during inevitable tragedy. Your protective equipment consists of whatever materials you can improvise from available supplies, none of which would meet modern standards for infectious disease prevention. You wear multiple layers of clothing that can be washed frequently, cover your face with cloth soaked in vinegar, and carry herbs that allegedly purify contaminated air. These measures provide psychological comfort more than actual protection, but comfort matters when working in lethal environments. The plague's impact on birth practices forces rapid adaptation of traditional procedures to minimize infection risk. You reduce the number of attendees during delivery from the usual community gathering to immediate family only, insist on more frequent hand washing with soap when available, and isolate newborns from obviously sick family members. These modifications work better than traditional approaches, though you attribute their success to spiritual rather than medical factors. Medieval understanding of plague transmission involved theories about corrupt air, astrological influences, and divine punishment that led to protective measures ranging from useless to actively harmful. Communities burned aromatic woods to purify atmospheres, adjusted diets according to humoral theory, and performed religious ceremonies that often increased infection rates through crowd gathering. You participate in these rituals while privately doubting their effectiveness. The logistics of maintaining medical practice during social collapse require skills that nobody taught you during midwifery training. You must locate and purchase supplies from disrupted trade networks, navigate between quarantined communities without spreading infection, and maintain professional relationships when normal social structures have disintegrated. Medieval pandemic response was basically improvised disaster management without institutional support. Your patient base shifts dramatically as plague eliminates traditional clients while creating new needs among survivors. Wealthy families who previously employed multiple midwives now depend on your services exclusively, while poor households that once relied on community support must hire professional help they can barely afford. The social disruption creates both opportunities and obligations that complicate professional practice. The psychological impact of working during plague affects every aspect of your mental health and professional confidence. You develop a fatalistic attitude toward personal survival that makes long-term planning seem pointless. But you continue working because pregnant women still need medical assistance regardless of apocalyptic circumstances. Professional duty becomes a form of psychological anchor during social catastrophe. Medieval plague chronicles document your profession's crucial role in maintaining population recovery during and after the pandemic. Midwives who survived the initial outbreak became essential community resources for rebuilding demographic stability. Your work ensuring successful births and infant survival contributed to long-term social recovery that took generations to complete. The demographic changes caused by mass mortality create unprecedented opportunities for professional advancement. With fewer midwives competing for clients, you can establish practice in regions previously served by other practitioners. The concentration of wealth among plague survivors also means higher fees for medical services, though the moral implications of profiting from catastrophe create ongoing ethical concerns. Your most successful innovations during plague practice involve developing new protocols for managing birth complications when traditional support systems have collapsed. You learn to perform procedures single-handedly that normally required multiple assistants, create makeshift equipment from available materials, and provide comprehensive care that extends far beyond normal midwifery responsibilities. The plague's religious implications affect every aspect of birth practices, as families struggle to maintain Christian customs while protecting themselves from infection. Baptisms become rushed ceremonies performed immediately after delivery. Christening gowns are burned rather than preserved as family heirlooms, and traditional celebrations are eliminated to avoid gathering potentially infected relatives. Medieval medical education during plague times becomes entirely experiential, as formal training systems collapse along with other social institutions. You learn new techniques through trial and error, share knowledge with surviving practitioners through chance encounters, and develop expertise in treating conditions that were rare before the pandemic but become common during social disruption. The most challenging aspect of plague-era practice involves maintaining professional standards while working under impossible conditions. You continue sterilizing instruments when possible, following proper birthing procedures despite time pressures, and providing emotional support to families experiencing multiple tragedies simultaneously. Professional competence becomes a form of resistance against social collapse. Your experience treating pregnant plague survivors reveals fascinating medical information about disease progression and maternal health that won't be formally documented for centuries. You notice that pregnant women seem slightly more resistant to initial infection but suffer worse outcomes if they do contract plague, probably due to immune system changes during pregnancy that medical science won't understand until modern times. The economic disruption caused by plague creates barter systems that replace traditional monetary payments for medical services. You accept payment in food, clothing, tools, and shelter rather than coins, adapting your practice to function within alternative economic arrangements that emerge during social crisis. These adaptations require business skills that no medieval training program included. Medieval record-keeping during plague becomes sporadic and unreliable, making it difficult to track birth rates, mortality statistics, or medical outcomes that would normally guide professional practice. You maintain personal notes about successful techniques and failed treatments, creating informal medical documentation that helps guide future decisions during ongoing crisis conditions. The most valuable lessons you learn during plague practice involve the importance of maintaining professional competence during crisis situations. When normal support systems collapse, medical practitioners become lifelines for community survival. Your ability to deliver babies safely and manage obstetric complications provides hope and practical assistance that helps families endure otherwise overwhelming circumstances. Your plague-era experience transforms your understanding of medical practice from routine professional service to essential community survival activity. The combination of increased responsibility, heightened danger, and social importance creates a new perspective on midwifery as crisis management rather than normal healthcare delivery. You emerge from the pandemic with enhanced skills, traumatic memories, and profound appreciation for the fragility of medieval life. Looking back on plague practice, you realize that continuing to work during the Black Death represented both professional heroism and practical necessity. Communities needed medical services regardless of infection risk, and someone had to provide them. Your survival and continued practice contributed to demographic recovery that enabled medieval society's eventual emergence from one of history's greatest catastrophes. You watch with growing alarm as university-trained male physicians begin muscling their way into your profession, armed with Latin degrees and complete ignorance about the practical realities of childbirth. These scholarly gentlemen have spent years studying ancient Greek texts about women's anatomy written by men who apparently never examined an actual female body. Yet they're convinced their theoretical knowledge trumps your decades of hands-on experience. It's like watching someone try to perform surgery after reading about it in a cookbook written by people who'd never seen a kitchen. The invasion begins subtly with physicians offering consultations during difficult births, positioning themselves as learned advisors who can provide scientific guidance to supplement your traditional techniques. They arrive carrying impressive leather-bound books filled with anatomical diagrams that bear only passing resemblance to real human bodies, spouting Latin terminology that sounds authoritative but describes imaginary medical conditions that don't actually exist. medieval medical education was fascinatingly disconnected from clinical reality, especially regarding women's health issues that male scholars couldn't experience personally. These university graduates learned that the female womb wandered around the body causing various ailments, that menstrual blood was inherently poisonous, and that pregnancy resulted from specific planetary alignments rather than biological processes. Their expertise was essentially elaborate fiction disguised as scholarly authority. Your first direct confrontation with physician interference occurs during Lady Catherine's difficult labor, when Dr. Aldrich arrives uninvited and immediately begins critiquing your methods. He insists that bloodletting will balance her humors and speed delivery, while you know from experience that blood loss during complicated births usually proves fatal. The tension becomes a medieval turf war fought over a woman's life. The social dynamics of this professional conflict reflect broader changes in medieval society as formal institutions began challenging traditional authority structures. Your knowledge came from generations of women teaching other women through practical experience, while physicians claimed legitimacy through university credentials and church approval. The question wasn't who provided better medical care, but whose authority society would ultimately recognize. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed their theoretical treatments were superior to traditional midwifery or simply sought to control lucrative medical markets. But your experience suggests most honestly thought university education made them qualified to manage childbirth. The gap between academic training and practical obstetrics was so vast that educated physicians often caused more harm than untrained midwives. The economic implications of physician competition threaten your livelihood as wealthy families begin preferring male doctors for prestigious deliveries. University credentials and Latin vocabulary impressed clients who equated formal education with medical competence, even when practical results suggested otherwise. You find yourself competing against practitioners whose primary qualification was literacy rather than clinical skill. Medieval gender politics complicated this professional rivalry, as society struggled to reconcile traditional female authority in childbirth with emerging male dominance in formal medical practice. Physicians argued that women's emotional nature made them unsuitable for making rational medical decisions, while you countered that men's lack of reproductive experience left them fundamentally ignorant about obstetric realities. Your most frustrating encounters with physician interference involve emergency situations where theoretical knowledge proves not only useless but actively dangerous. During breech presentations, physicians recommend positioning patients according to astrological calculations while you work frantically to manually turn babies into deliverable positions. Their scholarly interventions often complicate situations that practical experience could resolve effectively. The theological aspects of this conflict create additional challenges, as church authorities tend to support formally educated male physicians over traditional female healers. Religious doctrine suggested that women's spiritual weakness made them unreliable sources of medical knowledge, while university training implied divine approval of scholarly approaches to healing. You find yourself fighting not just professional competition but religious prejudice. Medieval medical licensing systems gradually emerged to regulate practice and limit unauthorized healing, creating legal frameworks that favored university-trained physicians over traditional practitioners. These regulations didn't necessarily improve patient care, but they did establish formal barriers between legitimate and illegitimate medical practice that systematically excluded women from professional recognition. Your defensive strategies involve emphasizing practical results over theoretical credentials, building relationships with families who've experienced both physician and midwife care, and demonstrating superior outcomes in direct comparisons. You learn to present your knowledge using medical terminology that sounds sufficiently scholarly while maintaining the hands-on approach that actually saves lives. The most dangerous aspect of physician competition involves their tendency to blame treatment failures on midwife interference rather than acknowledging limitations in their own knowledge. When their theoretical interventions prove ineffective, they often claim that traditional practices compromised proper medical care. This scapegoating threatens your professional reputation and could lead to accusations of incompetence or deliberate sabotage. Medieval obstetric instruments designed by university-trained physicians were often more impressive-looking than practically useful. Elaborate forceps, specialized birthing chairs, and complex positioning devices reflected scholarly theories about mechanical birth assistance, but they frequently caused more trauma than manual techniques developed through practical experience. You watch physician colleagues injure patients with sophisticated equipment while achieving worse outcomes. The social pressure to appear scientifically current forces you to adapt your practice by incorporating elements of formal medical terminology and procedure while maintaining effective traditional techniques. You learn to describe your methods using Latin phrases, document treatments in ways that seem scholarly, and present practical knowledge within frameworks that satisfy contemporary expectations for legitimate medical practice. Your most successful resistance to physician encroachment involves building alliances with female relatives of potential patients who understand the practical advantages of experienced midwifery over theoretical medicine. Medieval women often influenced medical decisions within their families, and mothers, grandmothers, and sisters who'd experienced both types of care frequently advocated for traditional practitioners. The institutional support that physicians enjoy through university connections and church approval creates systemic advantages that individual midwives cannot match through superior clinical results alone. Medical education, legal recognition, and religious endorsement provide structural power that transcends practical competence, gradually shifting professional authority regardless of actual patient outcomes. Medieval medical textbooks written by university scholars reveal the profound disconnect between formal medical education and obstetric reality. These authoritative works describe pregnancy and childbirth using theories borrowed from ancient sources that were already obsolete when originally written, creating multiple layers of misinformation disguised as scholarly wisdom. Physicians trained from these texts entered practice with confident ignorance about fundamental reproductive processes. Your documentation of successful treatments becomes increasingly important as physician competitors question the validity of traditional midwifery knowledge. You begin keeping more detailed records of patient outcomes, treatment methods, and case histories to demonstrate empirical evidence for your approaches. This record-keeping represents an early form of evidence-based medicine, though it lacks the statistical framework that wouldn't be developed for centuries. The psychological toll of fighting for professional survival while maintaining clinical excellence affects every aspect of your practice. You find yourself constantly defending legitimate medical knowledge against theoretical challenges from practitioners whose primary qualification is institutional approval rather than clinical competence. The stress of this ongoing conflict compounds the already demanding nature of obstetric emergency management. Medieval guild systems that regulated other trades gradually extended their influence to medical practice, creating formal structures that typically excluded women from membership and professional recognition. These organizations established training standards, licensing requirements, and practice protocols that favored university-educated practitioners over traditional healers, regardless of their relative clinical effectiveness. Your adaptation to changing professional circumstances requires developing new skills in political navigation, formal documentation, and scholarly presentation while maintaining the practical expertise that actually saves lives. You learn to operate within emerging institutional frameworks without compromising the hands-on approach that distinguishes effective midwifery from theoretical medicine. The long-term implications of physician competition extend beyond individual career concerns to broader questions about medical knowledge, professional authority, and gender roles in healing practices. Your resistance to male medical dominance represents part of a larger cultural struggle over who possesses legitimate authority to define health, treat illness, and make decisions about women's bodies. Medieval medical practice during this transitional period demonstrates how institutional power can override practical competence in determining professional hierarchy. The gradual displacement of traditional midwifery by formal medical practice reflected social and political changes rather than improvements in actual patient care, illustrating how medical authority develops through cultural processes that may not correlate with clinical effectiveness. Your survival in this changing landscape depends on proving that practical experience and clinical results matter more than institutional credentials and theoretical knowledge. While you cannot match physicians' formal education or legal recognition, you can demonstrate superior outcomes and maintain patient loyalty through effective medical care that addresses real rather than imaginary medical problems. Getting paid for saving lives turns out to be nearly as challenging as the actual life-saving part, because medieval economic systems apparently operated on the principle that essential services should be compensated through creative combinations of wishful thinking, agricultural products, and elaborate payment plans that might never materialize. You're essentially running a small business where your clients often can't afford your services, might not survive to pay their bills, and sometimes disappear entirely after receiving care, leaving you to pursue debt collection through medieval legal systems that favor debtors over creditors. Your payment negotiations begin before you even reach the birthing chamber, as families attempt to lowball your fees based on optimistic assumptions about how routine their delivery will be. They offer half your normal rate for simple births that inevitably become complicated emergencies requiring all your skills, expertise, and emergency supplies. It's like agreeing to build someone a house for the price of a shed, then discovering they want a castle with a moat and defensive fortifications. Medieval families had creative approaches to avoiding payment that would impress modern insurance companies. Common excuses included claiming the birth wasn't technically successful because the baby was born on an unlucky day, arguing that your services weren't necessary because divine intervention did the actual healing, or insisting that payment should be reduced because you used techniques they didn't specifically authorize. Some families simply relocated to distant villages, apparently believing that geographic distance canceled financial obligations. The barter economy that dominated medieval commerce creates ongoing logistical nightmares for your practice. You accept payment in grain, livestock, textiles, tools, and household goods. But converting these commodities into usable resources requires additional business skills that nobody taught you during midwifery training. Your cottage gradually fills with chickens, wool bales, and farming implements that you must somehow transform into rent money and herb supplies. Your most frustrating collection cases involve wealthy families who can definitely afford proper payment but choose to negotiate endlessly over fees they could easily cover. Merchants who own multiple properties and noble households with extensive land holdings suddenly become poor peasants when discussing medical bills, pleading poverty while wearing expensive clothing and serving imported wine during your visits. Medieval rich people apparently invented the concept of selective financial amnesia. Seasonal economic cycles affect your payment collection in ways that constantly surprise you. Harvest time brings abundance and prompt payment, but spring planting seasons leave families claiming they need every available resource for agricultural investment. Winter months combine universal poverty with increased medical needs, creating perfect storms of high demand and low compensation that threaten your professional survival. The legal systems available for debt collection were designed by people who apparently never worked in service industries, creating bureaucratic obstacles that favor debtors over legitimate creditors. Medieval courts required extensive documentation of agreements that were usually made verbally during medical emergencies, witness testimony from people who might have died or moved away, and legal fees that often exceeded the original debt amounts. Pursuing payment through official channels frequently cost more than the uncollected bills. Historians still argue whether medieval medical practitioners were typically well compensated for their services or struggled financially like other skilled artisans. But your daily experience suggests that income varied dramatically based on economic conditions, client demographics, and seasonal factors beyond your control. Successful midwifery practice required business acumen that complemented medical expertise, though nobody explained this dual requirement during your informal training. Your pricing strategies must balance affordability for clients against sustainability for your practice, creating ethical dilemmas that keep you awake at night. Charging rates that poor families can afford means accepting poverty yourself, while demanding adequate compensation prices your services beyond reach of people who desperately need medical care. Medieval healthcare economics forced practitioners to choose between financial survival and moral responsibility. The most challenging payment situations involve obstetric emergencies where families promise anything to save their loved ones, then suffer buyer's remorse once the crisis passes. Desperate relatives agree to substantial fees during life-threatening complications, but later argue that charging high rates during emergencies constitutes exploitation of their vulnerability. You find yourself caught between business necessity and accusations of profiteering from human suffering. Medieval record-keeping for debt collection required maintaining detailed accounts without standardized currency, measurement systems, or documentation practices. You track payments using personal notation systems that record wool quality, grain types, and livestock condition alongside monetary amounts, creating business records that look like inventory lists for medieval fantasy novels. Converting these complex transactions into useful financial information requires skills that medieval education systems didn't teach. Your credit evaluation techniques involve assessing family wealth through observation of clothing quality, household possessions, and agricultural holdings, since medieval people rarely volunteered accurate information about their financial circumstances. You learn to distinguish between temporary cash flow problems and permanent poverty, though even wealthy families might legitimately lack liquid assets during economic downturns or seasonal transitions. The most reliable payment arrangements involve installment plans that spread costs over multiple harvests or economic cycles, though these agreements require tracking numerous small payments over extended periods. You accept grain deliveries, textile installments, and livestock transfers according to complicated schedules that must accommodate agricultural seasons, market conditions, and family financial circumstances. Medieval payment plans made modern mortgage agreements look simple by comparison. Partnership arrangements with other service providers create alternative compensation systems that bypass traditional monetary exchange. You trade midwifery services for blacksmith work, carpenter repairs, and agricultural labor, establishing barter networks that provide essential goods and services without requiring cash transactions. These informal economies functioned effectively despite their complexity, though they demanded extensive social coordination. Your emergency fund consists of stored grain, preserved foods, valuable textiles, and hidden caches of precious metals that can sustain your practice during periods of low payment collection. Medieval economic uncertainty required maintaining diverse assets that retained value regardless of market conditions, currency fluctuations, or political instability. Your financial planning resembled disaster preparedness more than retirement savings. The social pressure to provide medical services regardless of payment capacity creates ongoing conflicts between professional obligations and personal survival needs. Medieval communities expected essential service providers to prioritize community welfare over individual profit, but they rarely offered institutional support for practitioners who couldn't collect adequate compensation. You're expected to be simultaneously businesswoman and charitable organization. Medieval medical insurance didn't exist, leaving families to budget for obstetric emergencies through personal savings, extended family support, or community assistance programs organized by religious institutions. These informal safety nets sometimes provided adequate coverage, but they frequently failed during widespread economic hardship or when multiple families needed expensive medical care simultaneously. Your collection enforcement options include public shaming, social pressure, and community mediation rather than legal remedies that rarely proved effective or affordable. Medieval debt collection relied heavily on reputation management and peer pressure, since defaulting families still needed to maintain relationships within their communities. Your success often depended more on social politics than legal rights. The economic vulnerability of relying on service fees for survival means that personal illness, injury, or family emergencies immediately threaten your financial stability. Unlike merchants who could sell inventory or farmers who owned productive land, your income depended entirely on your ability to work personally. Medieval service providers faced constant anxiety about maintaining earning capacity through inevitable health challenges and aging processes. Your retirement planning involves training potential successors who might eventually support you financially in exchange for professional knowledge and established client relationships. Medieval pension systems required creating personal networks of obligation and mutual support rather than relying on institutional programs that didn't exist. You invest in relationships and knowledge transfer rather than monetary savings accounts. The broader economic implications of your payment collection challenges reflect medieval society's struggle to value essential services appropriately within economic systems designed primarily for agricultural and manufactured goods. Medical care, like other crucial services, operated within informal economies that didn't always translate effectively into sustainable livelihoods for practitioners. Medieval economic instability meant that your most reliable clients might suddenly become unable to pay due to crop failures, political conflicts, or epidemic diseases that destroyed local prosperity. Your business planning required preparing for dramatic income fluctuations that could eliminate entire client bases overnight, forcing rapid adaptation to changing economic circumstances beyond your control. Your professional legacy depends not only on medical expertise and successful patient outcomes, but also on developing sustainable economic models that allow competent practitioners to maintain their practices long-term. Medieval midwifery required mastering both clinical skills and business management in environments that made both aspects challenging, creating career demands that tested human adaptability and resilience. Looking back on your career, you realize that the financial aspects of medieval medical practice were as crucial as clinical knowledge for professional survival. Your ability to navigate complex payment systems, manage diverse client relationships, and maintain economic stability while providing essential services represents achievement that extends far beyond medical expertise into entrepreneurial innovation under challenging historical circumstances. The wind down begins now, as your working years gradually fade into memory and your hands, once so steady during countless deliveries, start to show the tremors of age. You sit by your cottage window, watching younger women hurry past with their birthing bags, and feel a quiet satisfaction knowing that despite everything, the accusations, the politics, the impossible working conditions, you persevered. You caught babies when everyone else said it couldn't be done, saved lives when the odds were stacked against survival, and built a profession from nothing but determination and wisdom passed down through generations of women who refused to let mothers and children die without a fight. Medieval midwifery wasn't glamorous, well compensated, or particularly safe, but it was necessary, and you were there when it mattered most. The candlelight flickers lower, the sounds of the village settle into evening quiet, and you drift toward sleep knowing that tomorrow, somewhere, another woman will pick up your legacy and continue the ancient, essential work of bringing new life safely into an uncertain world.